Welcome to Reno Murders, Death in the Biggest Little City. I'm your host, Becca, and today we're going to talk about Julia Woodward and Janine Smith. To understand this story, you have to picture the place where it all happened, Hungry Valley. It's just north of Reno and Sparks. It's about 15, 20 miles from my own house. Hungry Valley is part of Pyramid Lake Paiute Reservation, stretching between Lemon Valley and the high desert basin that leads out towards Pyramid Lake. It's rugged land, sagebrush, rocky outcroppings, dusty trails carved out by off-roaders and wild horses. Tons of wild horses, by the way. It feels empty, isolated. In 1970s, Hungry Valley was remote, enough to hide things, to bury secrets. And that's exactly what happened in 1979. Julia Ann Woodward was 21 years old, born and raised in San Rafael, California. She grew up just north of San Francisco Bay, a place of redwood groves, quiet neighborhoods, and opportunity. Friends and family remember Julia as adventurous, independent, but restless. A young woman eager to step out into the world and carve her own path. She did have a streak of boldness, the kind that pushed her to take risks and to see what was out there. I know how that feels because I had that too. But she was also warm and outgoing, with the early 20s mix of excitement and uncertainty, trying to figure out where she belonged and what came next. In early 1979, Julia made a decision. She would leave San Rafael in search of something new. She told people she was planning to look for work in Nevada, possibly around Reno or Lake Tahoe. Resorts and casinos were booming in those years, with jobs for people willing to work hard, and for someone like Julia, Nevada represented possibilities. On February 1st of 1979, Julia was last seen alive at San Francisco International Airport. A friend dropped her off at the terminal. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. What we do know is that she never made it back. For nearly 2 months, Julia was missing. Then, on March 25th of 1979, hikers exploring the remote canyons of Hungry Valley, about 15 miles north of Reno, stumbled on something terrible. Julia's body lay in a shallow grave. She had been bludgeoned to death. Investigators reported that her hands were bound, one ankle cinched with a plastic zip tie. Her eyes were sealed shut with Band-Aids, a makeshift blindfold meant to rob her of sight, to terrify her in those last moments. Some of her clothing was missing, along with her identification. One of her shoes was gone. The discovery was brutal. Investigators at the time believed the killer was methodical, someone who wanted control. Covering the eyes, restraining the body, it spoke to a predator who didn't want to just kill, but to dominate. For Julia's family back in San Rafael, the news was devastating. They had clung to hope for nearly 2 months, imagining maybe she'd call. Maybe she was just delayed. Maybe she had found work, but was just too busy. Instead, they were told she was buried in the Nevada desert. Her young life had ended violently and senselessly. But for the Woodward family and Reno investigators, the nightmare was only just beginning. Just a few months after Julia Woodward's body was found in Hungry Valley, another young woman's story emerged, and this one hits even closer to home because Janine Smith was a Reno local. 17-year-old Janine Lee Smith was part of Reno's working-class youth. She lived in town, and like so many kids on the edge of adulthood, she was balancing a job, her friends, and her own ambitions. Janine worked at the brand new Circus Hotel and Casino, which had just opened a year earlier. At that time, it was 1978. Circus was Reno's newest family-oriented casino attraction. Bright lights, circus acts, carnival games, and a steady stream of tourists. For a 17-year-old like Janine, it meant steady work and a paycheck. She wasn't a high roller or a gambler. She was a kid doing shift work, helping the circus-themed casino run. Her job was part of the big Reno economy that evolved around gaming and entertainment, the kind of jobs young people took while they figured out what came next. Friends later said Janine was outgoing, a little tough, but had a really big heart. She could hold her own, but she was also still just a teenager. Let's remember, she was only 17, so she was trying to learn how to navigate an adult world. On the night of October 28th, in 1978, Janine left Circus at the end of her shift. She told a friend she was heading out to meet a man named Chuck. She said the plan was to buy some cocaine from him. A detail that might sound shocking, but in the nightlife of 1970s Reno, drugs circulated easily, especially around casinos. And let's remember, while not every 17-year-old was wanting to do cocaine, there's always a lot that are. That was the last time anyone saw Janine alive. She never came home. Her family reported her missing, but like many missing young women at the time, the case didn't make big headlines. And as I'm sure you're noticing, the 1970s and the 1980s, Reno was a real hotspot for missing young ladies and even men. Over a year later, on November 2nd, 1979, hunters in Lemon Valley, an isolated desert stretch just north of Reno, stumbled on human remains. The body had been reduced mostly to bone. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office confirmed it was Janine. Her remains were buried in a shallow grave, and the forensic details were grim. She had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head. Her clothing was disturbed. Investigators noted her zipper had been forced open. One shoe was missing. Some of her personal items, including identification, were gone. Even more chilling, there were indications that her eyes had been covered, possibly with some sort of tape or bandages, just like in Julia Woodward's case. The similarities were undeniable to investigators. Think about it. Julia's body had been found in Hungry Valley, March of 1979. Janine's body was discovered just 8 months later in Lemon Valley, not far from each other. The two graves were barely 1 mile apart. Both young women had been restrained. Both had been bludgeoned. Both had items of clothing and personal effects missing. To investigators, it looked like the same predator. But in 1979, without DNA technology or modern forensics, they couldn't make a leap from suspicion to proof. So Julie's case stayed unsolved, and Janine's case stayed cold. For decades, the cases of Julia and Janine, they sat silent. After Julia's body was discovered in Hungry Valley in March, her family pressed authorities for answers. They wanted names, arrests, some kind of justice, but nothing came. Meanwhile, Janine's disappearance barely made headlines. She was a Reno girl, only 17, and she vanished. When her skeletal remains were found in Lemon Valley later that year, the crime scene, of course, echoed Julia's. But still, there was no suspect who was ever named. If you've listened to my other episodes, you should be noticing a theme, definitely around this time in Reno's past. This is also around the time that 2 girls went missing from the state fair and were named as runaways. And then another girl the year prior went missing from the Reno State Fair as well and was also depicted as a runaway. All these girls were going missing around the same time. The 2 girls from the Reno State Fair and the one from the year prior do end up getting linked to a killer couple who were actually serial killers operating in the area at the time. But I do find it interesting that in Reno during this time, a 17-year-old girl can vanish, a body later be found that is confirmed to be her, and it barely makes headlines. But then again, the girls from the state fair were 13, 14, and I believe the other one was 16 or 15 years old, and they labeled them runaways. I don't think investigators were doing everything they could, or if they were, maybe they were just understaffed and overwhelmed. You can only speculate. By the early 90s, both cases were boxed up and filed away in Washoe County's evidence room. Paper files grew yellow, witnesses moved on, and the detectives retired. The Woodward and Smith families were left with rumors, unanswered questions, and the kind of grief that never dulls. Every so often, their names surfaced in cold case meetings. Detectives would pull the files, hoping for fresh eyes to spark something new, but there was never enough. For the public, the cases faded into the background of Reno's history, overshadowed, but time has a funny way of catching up with monsters. Evidence doesn't rot as fast as people think. And when science finally caught up, when DNA testing advanced, when cold case teams began reopening files, yay for cold case teams, Julia's story and Janine's came back to life. In 2019, after 40 long years of silence, police finally named a suspect in the murder of Julia. His name was Charles Gary Sullivan. At the time of his arrest, Sullivan was 73 years old, living in Washoe County. To his neighbors, he looked like any other old, aging Nevada man. He was quiet, he was gruff, mostly keeping to himself. He had a wife who publicly stood by him, by the way, insisting the system was wrong. He blended into the landscape of retirees, ranchers, and working class folks who lived in the high desert area around Reno. But Sullivan's past told a very different story. Charles Gary Sullivan was a Nevada native with deep roots and ties to the region. In the 70s, he lived and worked around Reno, known in certain circles as a man who had a taste for control, especially over women. His criminal record was spotted with accusations of sexual assault and violence. Some of these cases never went to trial. Others ended up being dropped or reluctant witnesses. Several women over the years described encounters with Sullivan that followed the same disturbing pattern. He would lure them with promises of drugs, alcohol, sometimes just a ride. He would bind them with restraints, often zip ties or ropes. He would blindfold them, sometimes with medical tape or even band-aids pressed over their eyes. And then he would assault them, leaving them terrified, humiliated, and discarded. Court records later revealed that at least 3 separate women accused him of attacks that mirrored the way Julia had been found in Hungry Valley. It was a pattern so specific that prosecutors later said it was his signature. Sullivan continued working as a contractor and handyman. I'm so sorry to any handyman out there, but how many times have you heard about a handyman who was a murderer? Way too many times. I'm sorry. It's starting to freak me out about handymen. Anyways, moving between Nevada and Arizona back and forth where he was working, he lived what seemed like a low-profile life, especially at his age. In 2007, his name popped up again when another woman reported he had tied her up during an encounter, but like the earlier cases, never stuck in court. By this time, Sullivan was in his 60s, appearing like a retiree, but still keeping the same disturbing behaviors under the surface. When Sullivan's name came back up in 2019, investigators immediately thought he was connected to more than one case. They had the evidence from Julia Woodward's murder in Hungry Valley. Details matched Sullivan's known behavior with other women, which had been documented numerous times at this point. Then there was Janine Smith, whose remains were found only a mile away. The similarities were way too close to ignore, so law enforcement quietly admitted they believed Sullivan was likely tied to multiple disappearances and murders in northern Nevada from that era. Julia Woodward's case was the one that they could prove, though. So Janine Smith's case and perhaps others, sadly, never had enough physical evidence or DNA to reach a courtroom. The short answer is science, right? 1979 DNA testing didn't exist. So we all know this, and we all are now seeing all of these crimes come to light in this last 5 years or so. And it's just exposing all of these murderers. Really good to see that this is bringing these murderers out of the woodwork, these people who have continued to live within our society and go on with their lives while they've taken others. Investigators could only rely on fingerprints, eyewitnesses, and confessions. So Sullivan was slippery back then. He intimidated a lot of victims, and without airtight evidence, prosecutors couldn't make the charges stick. As I mentioned, a lot of these victims dropped the charges. What does that tell you? He was definitely intimidating some victims. As time passed, evidence sat in boxes, as I had discussed, but when Nevada and other states began reviewing all these unsolved homicides using the modern DNA analysis, of course, Julia's file was pulled again. And that's when that forensic evidence, combined with the testimony of the women who had survived Sullivan's assaults, could finally close that gap. Now, in 2019, Sullivan was arrested in Sierra Vista, Arizona, where he had been living part of the time. The FBI and Washoe County investigators coordinated to bring him in. When the news broke, headlines described him as a retired contractor, a man who had seemed ordinary for decades. But to law enforcement, he was a predator who had simply aged out of suspicion. Prosecutors filed an open murder charge for Julia Woodward's case, confident they could finally connect him to her death. Even at 73, Sullivan's arrest carried weight, proved that predators cannot always hide behind time, that even decades later, the desert still gave up its secrets. You can't help but wonder, did this person really just stop killing and raping for decades? And most likely, no, because you've got several decades there where he was probably still fit enough to carry out this sick behavior. Since Julia Woodward wasn't the only girl buried in the desert, Janine Smith's family and the families of the other women who disappeared in northern Nevada during the late 70s, they're still waiting for justice. Prosecutors painted a grim picture for the jury. They explained how Julia Woodward had been found in Hungry Valley. Her hands were bound, her eyes sealed with the band-aids, her body dumped in the shallow grave. The injuries showed how she had been bludgeoned to death. They laid out Sullivan's pattern of behavior, how multiple women had accused him over the years of luring them out, binding them, blindfolding them, and leaving them vulnerable. But as the trial date neared, time had eroded parts of this case. Witnesses had grown old. Evidence was limited to what had survived 40 years in storage. Prosecutors faced the same challenge all cold cases do, proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for decades of silence. In June of 2023, Sullivan entered a no contest plea to second-degree murder in Julia Woodward's case. A no contest plea means he didn't admit guilt, but he accepted conviction and punishment as if he had. For the Woodward family, it was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, there would finally be a conviction. Julia's name would not set in the cold case files anymore. On the other hand, Sullivan was not admitting what he had done, not speaking Julia's name in responsibility. And that left a raw wound. The judge sentenced Sullivan to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. For a man already in his 70s, it could have been a life sentence. But for Julia's family, it felt too light for the brutality of the crime. Julia's loved ones told the court that nothing could bring her back, but at least her case was no longer forgotten. Just a year later, in June 2024, Sullivan went before the Nevada Parole Board. He was 78 years old. His attorney argued that his age and health should be considered, but the board reviewed the case, the brutality of Julia's murder, and his long history of predatory behavior. They voted to deny him parole. And I couldn't agree with them more. Sullivan will have another chance in 2027, but whether he survives to see that day is definitely uncertain. For Julia's family, the conviction was a form of recognition, right? Finally, the state of Nevada said out loud she was murdered and Charles Gary Sullivan was responsible. But the story isn't complete because Janine Smith's case and the others like her, they still remain unsolved. And unless more evidence emerges, Julia will most likely be the only victim whose name is officially tied to Sullivan in an actual court. There's another name that appears in connection with him, and it is another cold case. Her name is Linda Taylor. Her story is much quieter than Julia or Janine's because her body was never found. But her disappearance has enough curious clues that many believe she might have been another victim connected to Charles Sullivan. Linda Taylor was only 23 years old when she disappeared in March of 1979. Her last known location was Reno, Nevada. She was reported missing by her roommate. A few days later, Linda's car was found abandoned in a grocery store parking lot in Reno. It was about 10 miles from where the bodies of Julia and Janine were later discovered. Investigators say Sullivan admitted to dating Linda Taylor. He initially said he didn't know her, then later said that they had gone on a date. Prosecutors saw enough in the pattern of her disappearance and timing to consider her case alongside Julia and Janine's. But the evidence was never strong enough to charge him because, again, no body, no DNA. When you look at that long shadow Charles casts over Reno in the 70s, in the 80s, and beyond, it's clear he wasn't just a man who killed once. He was a predator with a very distinct psychological pattern. At the center of Sullivan's psychology was control. Survivors who escaped his assaults in the 80s and in the 90s described the same ritual. He would lure them somewhere isolated. So, at the center of Sullivan's psychology is definitely control. By blindfolding them, he didn't just prevent them from seeing him, he controlled their reality. He controlled what they heard, what they felt, and what they feared. To Sullivan, the act of dominating women this way wasn't secondary, it was the point. Some women managed to escape after being raped by Sullivan. They ran or he let them go once he got what he wanted. But then there was obviously Julia and Janine, the women who never walked away. Why the difference? Psychologists who study predatory offenders note that when patterns repeat this long, escalation is almost inevitable. Some victims survive because in that moment, the predator doesn't feel the need to kill. Others die because the predator takes the fantasy further to its final lethal conclusion. In Julia's case, she was not only bound and blindfolded, she was bludgeoned to death and buried. That progression from domination to murder shows an offender who needs to eliminate the victim completely. It suggests Julia saw or knew something he feared, or that killing itself became part of that ritual. It's what criminologists call a sexual sadist with coercive control tendencies. So the sadism, he's deriving satisfaction not just from sex, but from the victim's fear, their humiliation, and their helplessness. And then coercive control, carefully staging situations so he could bind, blindfold, and terrorize the women. And then, of course, compartmentalization. Outwardly living a normal life, working jobs, marrying, retiring, while privately indulging in this hidden violent persona. This split is why his neighbors later described him as a quiet or ordinary man. That mask of normalcy, of course, helped him offend for decades without going to prison. The truth is, Sullivan's victims often weren't believed. Some were too traumatized to testify, others feared retaliation. Some women escaped, some women vanished, and no one could nail him down until 40 years later. To understand Sullivan is to see the cold calculation of a predator who didn't act on impulse. He prepared, he planned, he ritualized his control. And whether a woman survived or not depended less on luck than on Sullivan's decision in that moment, whether he was satisfied with domination alone or whether he needed to take that final step into murder. Two young women, Julia Woodward, 21, and Janine Smith, just 17. Their lives stolen in 1979. One case solved, the other still cold, and probably so many more left unsolved that could be connected to him. Hungry Valley hasn't changed much since then. It's still open desert, still vast and empty. If you drive out there, you can see why it worked as a dumping ground, why predators believed their secrets would stay buried. But sometimes the desert does give up its secrets.